I'm Keith with the Trombone Shop at Schmidt Music, back with another instrument review for you. And today I've got an instrument that has been a arguably staple bass trombone in our community for a lot of years, but it's something that I've just never really had come through the shop before, specifically the Yamaha YBL-822G bass trombone. This instrument, of course, was famously designed with the great Doug Yeo, and this is arguably one of the most popular and frankly most commercially available dependent professional bass trombones still on the market. So, like I said, we've had this instrument pass through. I've never been able to really spend a lot of time with it, and we're really excited to share the experience with you. So I'm going to take a play, talk about this afterwards. I'm going to be playing everything today on my trusty Hammond 19BL mouthpiece. As I mentioned in the open, while we have had any number of different Yamaha bass trombones come through the shop, instruments that we've been able to spend time with, in particular, they're professional, the 830 and then the 835 independent models, the 822, which has been kind of their alternative staple bass trombone designed with Doug Yeo, is just not the one that we've had in the shop a lot. And frankly, it makes a certain amount of sense in today's bass trombone world. The independent setup is just not as called for, but it absolutely has a place. And I would argue that the 822 is, especially on a that accessible professional front, there is no dependent bass trombone that is more famous, more well-known than the 822G. So, a few basics about the 822G here. So, this has got a 9.5-inch gold brass bell with gold brass tuning slide, a 563 bore hand slide, yellow brass outer tubes with yellow brass crook, and of course chrome-plated nickel-silver inners, and of course it has the dual dependent rotors here as well. There is obviously a number of different philosophies behind bass trombone playing, especially orchestral playing. What Yamaha says about this instrument is that this is like the perfect orchestral bass trombone. Okay, well, why is that, or why could that be argued? Well, I think a lot of it is, it comes down to playing style, of course, and we know that the dependent idea, this is something that Doug Yeo has been a champion of for a lot of years. Why is that? So, just a quick primer, in case we're not familiar with what's the difference between independent and dependent bass trombones and valves. So independent valve setups just mean that we can use each of the two valves on their own independently. There are a number of different tuning sets for this. Traditionally today, they are set up with the first valve in F, second valve in G flat, which gives us a low D. Right? And the advantage of this setup is that you can use either of the valves on their own, in particular, the second valve, the G flat valve, for alternate positions, right? For certain arpeggio combinations, scale combinations, repertoire, whatever, it gives us alternative options that can be really beneficial in that, below the staff, that, the trigger pedal register, right? But with the dependent setup, the whole idea here is that in order to use the second valve, we already have to be using the air. We have to putting the air through the first valve. Now, what's the advantage of it? On the face of it, it just means that, well, wait, we're losing options. Right now, I can't use the second valve on its own. Well, the advantage here is that we're not always sending the air through both valves, right? Especially on the open instrument or when we're using just the F attachment, arguably, right? We don't have the same amount of resistance, and especially on the open instrument, there is a real difference to the airflow, the blow of it. And that's something I'll actually talk a little bit with the experience, right? So you get an instrument that overall feels a little bit more open. Now, what's the downside? Well, A, you don't have the option of using the second valve independently for some of these different alternate position valve combinations. And in theory, it also means that there's going to be a bigger change in the amount of resistance once we go on to the valves. Now, there's a change in that resistance, to be sure. Is it positive? Is it negative? Well, I think that's a little bit up to the player, right? So my experience with this instrument, and arguably it'd been a while since I'd had a chance to play one. My first impression with this was what a wonderfully kind of balanced, and the first term that came to mind was almost cushiony sound, right? It has just this wonderful kind of pillowiness to it, but it's not getting like super diffuse. It has real definition to the outside of sound. And for me, I feel like it's putting a lot of projection outward. Like I'm certainly getting some feedback from my side of the valve. I feel like it's putting a lot of sound outward, which is interesting to me, given how much gold brass we have in between the bell, between the tuning slide. A lot of times we would expect kind of more of this warmth to the sound, but at the same time, we expect the sound to be spread a little bit more sideways. I might expect to get more feedback. With this setup, I feel like it's putting a lot of sound outward, and I think with just the single valve airflow idea, I definitely feel like I'm able to put more volume, more kind of breadth of volume, and thus get more sound out of it when I'm really laying through the horn. Now, when I go onto the valves, then the compression, the resistance does change. It's not inherently in a bad way, right? And now, and I understand there are different concepts behind this. This is why for a lot of players, more open valve setups like the axial flow valves, especially if you're doing a dual independent setup, those stacked axial flow valves are going to do a better job of balancing that resistance. They're gonna feel more open, right, than, for example, rotors. With this setup, I certainly get a little bit of change in resistance, but it's something I feel like I can play with, right? When I'm going down to, especially into some of those dual valve combinations, I can feel the push, but it's not necessarily fighting against me. In a certain respect, I feel like it's something I can kind of lean against a little bit. Some of the, the low Cs, the low B naturals, they're not, it's a little bit different approach. I feel like I have to touch them a little bit differently, but not nearly as much as some other bass trombone setups where I've played, where as soon as you go onto those valves, boy, you're just hitting the brakes. This feels a little bit more continuous with it, but it's giving a certain amount of compression that I don't necessarily mind. I like the fact that in the trigger register, I feel like the compression is giving me the ability to lean into some of these notes a little bit, give them a little bit different edge, a little bit different focus than we might get, say, off of an axial flow setup where everything is just staying more open, more even, right? And again, not a better or worse, just a difference here. Now, are there disadvantages to this, this more open setup? Well, for me, as a player, one of the things I did notice is getting into the upper register. So we're talking 6 partial and beyond. I definitely had to work differently. And that kind of makes sense because, again, on the open horn, this is going to be a more open setup than arguably, even a dual axial flow independent setup. This is going to be more open in theory, right? And so I could feel a little bit of that. Now, how much time? It depends on what you're doing, right? If you're doing a lot of solo repertoire, etc. with it, are you going to need to have a lot of that delicacy in the upper register? Perhaps, right? But if you're not, if you're using it, again, as they say, as a more true orchestral instrument, maybe that's not as big of a deal. One other thing about the 822G that is really, really interesting, and this is something that folks have certainly talked about before, is the fact that you can remove the second valve entirely. It's a very clever setup with this, and it's really easy we're just going through basically you just unscrew the linkage for the second valve. There's one control, kind of, locking screw up on top here and screw, and literally the whole valve section comes out. I went through, it's been a while since I did it. I just tried it yesterday. It takes a little bit of practice, but it's really very, very accessible. And then you have a single rotor. Again, you've got, a bass trombone, with just an F attachment. Now, again, what's the advantage of that? Well, depends on what you're needing to do with it, right? Depending on the repertoire that you're doing, there may be times that you don't even feel like you need to have the second valve, and removing some of that resistance. Because again, when we're using the F attachment, the air is having to pass through that second valve. So if you remove that extra resistance, it's going to change the experience, right? Now, how often, for a lot of players, how often are they going to want to be playing a single rotor bass trombone? Don't know, but it's a really nice option, and frankly, it's about as well an engineered option as I've seen with something like this. So I think that's really well done. That does lead to a couple of weird things with it. First off, in general with Yamaha, I'm not as big of a fan of especially their second paddle setups. Right, for a lot of folks, we've gone to more of a tubular setup for the nickel silver rod down here, which gives us more rotation with the paddle. Yamaha continues to use a square paddle. So we're able to move it vertically, but we aren't able to have any rotational change at all. So it's something where you might have to play around with it a little bit to find kind of the right position with that. With this particular setup, with how they're doing the removable linkage here, it does mean that your spring is sitting kind of right down at the bottom where, at least for me, my hand ends up sitting right next to it, so that can be a little bit uncomfortable as well here. Overall experience, though, is really, really positive, right? I think it's a great playing option. It's frankly an instrument that maybe deserves a little bit more attention. It'll be interesting to see if that attention changes. I feel like, at least in the the players I'm interacting with, we are seeing a little bit of a shift in what bass trombone players are looking for. Obviously, the axial flow valve setups continue to be really popular, but they're not the only option out there. I'm certainly seeing players who are doing things, who are, in their playing, or maybe gravitating more towards rotor setups. I think this provides a really great opportunity within that as well. And again, it's got the Yamaha quality consistency behind it, which can always be really advantageous. So I hope you enjoyed my review of the YBL-822G here. If you have any thoughts about this bass trombone, maybe you've got a chance to play this or its predecessor, the 622, maybe you have thoughts about independent versus dependent setups, please feel free to leave them in the comments. If you haven't already done so, consider subscribing to the channel. Think about giving this video a thumbs up. Hit that notification button so you can see when we have other videos come out. And of course, you can find the Trombone Shop on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. As always, thanks for watching.